Hi, thanks for tuning in today. One of the things I've been asked about before is, which is superior, the majority text or the Textus Receptus. And one of the things I wanted to do is just really kind of explain the difference between what's been called the Byzantine text form or the majority text and the Textus Receptus. And really just talk a little bit about what kind of differences we're talking about, how different are they, that sort of thing. Sometimes in the past, the term Textus Receptus and majority text have been sort of conflated as the same thing, and they're not exactly the same thing. There's places in the Textus Receptus that have areas and verses that are not well supported by extant Greek witnesses. That's not to say that they might not find support in other witnesses, such as Latin or something like that. But there are places in the Greek New Testament which currently, as our manuscripts are have come down to us in the Greek witnesses, are not well supported in those extant witnesses. One of the examples would be like 1 John 5:7. There was a fairly recent debate between Dr. Jeff Riddle, Dr. James White, discussing one of these in Ephesians. I think it's the maybe the third chapter. But there are a few examples like this, and what I want to walk you through today is talk a little bit about how different is the Textus Receptus from the Byzantine text. So the Textus Receptus, there's different editions of the Textus Receptus, and perhaps before we talk about the difference between the majority text and the Textus Receptus, we talk a little bit about the differences that we have in the Textus Receptus itself. So when people refer to the Textus Receptus, they're primarily referring to the text that dominated the Reformation era, that came down through people like Erasmus, and then people like Beza and Stephanus. And those editions have some minor variations between one another. So the Scrivener edition of the Textus Receptus is the one that's most widely used now. It's the one that's been easiest to get because the Trinitarian Bible Society, for example, has continued to publish that edition. Now, the difference between the Textus Receptus as it's displayed now and as it's easiest to get your hands on, the difference between that and the edition of, say, Beza is about the difference of about 190 very minor variant units. And so when you're reading, I know 190, that maybe that sounds like a lot, but it's really not. A lot of that has to do with very minor differences. And I'll show you in just a minute some of those differences, give you an example. But basically, when you're reading the edition that's come down to us through Scrivener, as it's been published by something like the Trinitarian Bible Society, you're reading essentially the same text that came down through Beza and was the Reformation era text. It's not like we're talking about something that's totally different. When you talk about the difference between the Textus Receptus and the majority text or Byzantine text, one of the things I did is I actually went through almost the entire Gospel of John, I think for maybe the exception of one or two chapters, and I actually noted all the differences between the majority text or the Robinson-Pierpont text, the Byzantine text, and the Textus Receptus as it's been displayed to us in Scrivener's text. So what I'm going to do in a little bit is I'll zoom down on this text, and you can kind of take a look at it, and we can look at the differences ourselves. So you can get a feel for how different are these two texts? How different is the Textus Receptus from the majority text? Now, and the purpose of this video is not to tell you which of those two texts are better necessarily. the purpose of this video is to show you the degree of difference that's involved there. So we'll zoom down on the text, we'll look at that, and so just to kind of give you a feel, we're talking about a difference of about 1,800 variants. Now that sounds like a lot, but I think as you'll see, most of those variants are, again, most people wouldn't even bother their minds with. Why I went through and made so many notations in my Greek New Testament is just because there's certain people like us who kind of nerd out on this kind of stuff. But we'll look at that. We're talking about 1,800 variants, and I don't have a precise number here, but I could tell you that probably about half of those aren't even translatable. They're so minuscule that it has to do with things like word order, which that might sound like a big deal when you're talking about English, but when you're talking about Greek word order can vary quite a bit and carry the same kind of meaning. So you would translate it exactly the same. So now you're down to maybe roughly 1,000 variants, which again sounds like a big number, and it is. But when we zoom down on the text, I think you'll see the kinds of differences we're talking about. The other thing I would mention is that there's a few places where the variants are more major. These are well known. 1 John 5:7 is the most famous difference, I would say, between the majority text and the Textus Receptus. The three witnesses that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, I think is how it's worded there. That's probably, 1 John 5:7 is probably the biggest variant. Another one is in Acts, where you have, when Philip is about to baptize the Ethiopian eunuch, he says, "If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest." Where the majority text and the Textus Receptus come together is they would retain the two most major textual variants, which would be John 8, the woman caught in the act of adultery, and the last section of the chapter of Mark. Both the majority text and the Textus Receptus would unite to retain those texts. So we'll take a moment, we'll zoom down on this text, just bearing in mind this is the overall differences between these. The Textus Receptus has come out of the Byzantine stream, mostly speaking. There's a few times where, like in 1 John 5:7, where even from the very early days, like in Erasmus and the time of Erasmus, when he's publishing his Greek New Testament, his first Greek New Testament did not contain the relevant textual variant there. And there's, some discussion about how that came into the text, and Erasmus had basically made the point that, he didn't have any manuscripts in his possession that had the text in it, so a manuscript was found or produced, one or the other. There's some dispute about that contained the words, and Erasmus put the famous comma Johanneum into 1 John 5:7. So there's a few examples like that where the differences are fairly major, but for the most part, we'll zoom down on the text and we'll get a feel for the differences between the Byzantine text form and the Textus Receptus, the differences that are there. And just to pick up that thought, the Textus Receptus is a pretty good representative of that broader Byzantine stream. So let's zoom down on the text. We'll take a look at it, and you'll get a feel for what's the difference between the Byzantine text or the majority text and the Textus Receptus. So stay with me. Okay, so what I have here is Scrivener's Annotated Greek New Testament. That's the title that the publisher gave this edition. The secondary publisher. This was originally published by Cambridge University Press. That was not the title that they gave this originally. This was titled The New Testament in Greek, according to the text followed in the Authorized Version, together with the variations adopted in the Revised Version. So Scrivener had done this to make sure that all the differences between the Revised Version and the King James Version could be noted. Now, what I mentioned to you at the beginning of this video was that this text does vary some from Beza's edition. All of those places have been noted by Scrivener with an asterisk. And those are few and far between. As I get towards the end of this video, I'll kind of give you a feel for the differences between this text and what Beza had put together. But what I did is I went through and noted all the differences, with the exception of perhaps like a movable new, for example, which would be more like a spelling, just a a very, very, very minor spelling difference. But I've noted in purple, I've highlighted in purple the differences so you could see them. And we'll go through about 5 or 6 pages. This page, the first page, the Gospel of John, there's no differences between the Robinson-Pierpont text and the Textus Receptus. By the time you get to the second page, you have one difference. And again, it's basically just a proper name, a location, and more about how you're going to spell it than anything else. So not a huge difference there. Now, here we have a difference in the text where John, the word John, basically is omitted. There's a spelling difference here. Here, the name Jesus is omitted. It's implied but omitted by the Robinson-Pierpont text. Here you can see this page, there's absolutely no difference. On this page, you have an article that's missing in the Robinson-Pierpont text, or not present in the Robinson-Pierpont text. Again, you have an entire page here where there's absolutely no difference, except for an untranslatable difference where you have an article before Jesus. So something like Jesus answered. The way you translate that, whether it's in the Textus Receptus or the majority text, is Jesus answered. So that's really an untranslatable difference there. You've got, a difference between a plural and a singular here. You've got an omission of basically to me. You've got, in this entire page, you have one difference between the majority text and the Robinson-Pierpont text. The Robinson-Pierpont text is going to omit the word again here. And he departed again into Galilee. Again, on this next page, you have different forms of erchomai, or erchomai, depending on what pronunciation your systems you're using there. Basically, whether it's in the subjunctive mood or not, you have a difference, another untranslatable difference. Basically, you can kind of get a feel for a bunch of very, very minor differences. Here's the difference between, you see this purple mark here, the difference between this is whether it's going to be Jesus or the Jesus, but you're going to translate it the same way. Sometimes the majority text will agree with the critical text. Sometimes it won't, against the Textus Receptus. Sometimes the Textus Receptus will agree with the critical text against the majority text. One thing to note is, one thing that I thought was interesting was the degree of variation tended, at least in my mind, tended to increase in the large textual variant that's found in John chapter 8 with the woman caught in the act of adultery. There's quite a bit of variation between the Byzantine text and the Textus Receptus. So if you're still with me, you're still watching this, I want to give you a book, possibly a book recommendation here. And this is from the perspective of a TR advocate, but it's very helpful in that you can see he's selected most of the meaningful and variants between the majority text and the TR, and he goes into the different manuscript support for that. So whether you share his perspective or not, it doesn't really matter too much to me, but if you want to see the differences laid out very clearly, especially the more meaningful ones, this would be a book that you could look at. If you want a full review of this, leave a comment down in the comment section, let me know. But the last thing I just wanted to show you is the kinds of differences between Beza and the Scrivener edition. So in the appendix of this edition of Scrivener, there is listed the variants, and there's only 190 of those, and you can see for yourself here, you're talking about very, very minor differences for the most part. Some of these are going to come down to like spelling differences of proper names, things of that nature. So sometimes when people, there's bad arguments that are put forward on both sides. It's people who attack, people who support the Textus Receptus like to talk sometimes about the Scrivener text as being a fake Greek text. I don't really appreciate when people do that, not because I'm a diehard Textus Receptus defender myself, although I appreciate and value the Textus Receptus, but just because I think it's just bad argumentation, because this is essentially the same Greek text that Beza used with very few minor differences, and all of those differences were already displayed in other printed Greek editions. So there it is. Kind of give you a feel for the differences, mostly very, very minor differences, but 1,800 differences is 1,800 differences. There's quite a few. I mean, quite a few differences. And so people who advocate for the majority text and people who advocate for the Textus Receptus are not necessarily defending the same position. So just wanted to lay that out in a video, and so that you could see clearly. I've got lots and lots of marks there where you can see the differences, but they're all of that same ilk. So anyways, that's enough for today, and so I hope that gives you a feel for the difference between the Textus Receptus and the majority text.